Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Dragon Age Origins is definitely the most beloved game in this series. If I would have to name the strongest aspect of Origins and the reason why this game managed to deliver such an amazing experience, that would definitely be the story and memorable characters. When it comes to gameplay mechanics, Origins adopted a more traditional style that's reminiscing of classic RPGs from early 2000s. That was not surprising at all. I mean, it's the same studio that developed most of those classic RPGs from that time period. The highly tactical combat from Origins wasn't going to last for long in this series. People didn't expect that Dragon Age 2 will drastically change the core gameplay design and almost completely abandoned every tactical aspect of the first game. But this design decision didn't exactly come out of nowhere. Even in Origins, there are glimpses of how BioWare was trying to make this series appealing to different kinds of RPG players. The third-person camera was obviously an attempt to make the gameplay feel more like an action RPG, even though the combat was far from it. You might argue that third-person camera in Origins was just one of the options to play the game, but judging by the sequels, I think BioWare was struggling with this right from the beginning. The third-person perspective was the default camera option in Origins for a reason. That's understandable. When it comes to transition between cutscenes and dialogues, it creates a more immersive storytelling experience. And we can't say the same about the isometric camera. But getting you closer to action was definitely one of the reasons for third-person camera as the default option. Otherwise, this game could easily work as any other CRPG with just the isometric camera mode. Trying to make your game appealing to more people is not a bad thing, but BioWare didn't exactly do a good job when it comes to this, to put it lightly. And I'm saying that as a gamer who prefers action-oriented combat systems in RPGs. Not because I think they are better objectively, it's just a personal preference. Whether it's tactical real-time with pause or third-person action, both of these combat systems have their flaws. Real-time with pause or turn-based RPGs usually don't have mechanics that require a proper reaction time from the player, while action-oriented RPGs can be really weak when it comes to strategy elements in combat. Trying to make something in between sounds really good on paper, but maybe not so much in practice. When Dragon Age Inquisition came out, they kinda backpedaled a bit. They tried to bring back the tactical options from Origins, while still heavily relying on third-person action combats. However, the tactical features of Inquisition's combat were noticeably streamlined, although still a lot better than Dragon Age 2. When it comes to action side of things, Inquisition's combat was noticeably slower than Dragon Age 2. One of the obvious reasons for that was to try and make the tactical approach to combat more viable. The combat in Dragon Age Inquisition was jack of all trades but master of none. That's what usually happens when you're trying to please everyone. The tactical camera in Inquisition was really bad and hard to use. There was a high chance that AI would just simply refuse to take your input from the pause menu, so you would just waste your time and your nerves. This made the tactical camera unreliable, janky and almost useless. You might be asking yourself how come this studio managed to pull off such a great tactical combat in Origins and then completely screw it up in Inquisition. Well, besides the problems I already mentioned, I think the engine which the game was using was definitely part of the problem. A big part of the problem actually. Erin Flynn, a former BioWare developer, had an article about the difficulties of working with this engine. Very delicate and very hard to manage, he said. Broadly speaking, the tools BioWare was using were not as strong as we had on previous titles. That actually explains a lot. This engine was simply not suitable for an RPG of this type, or an RPG of any type basically. The bad news is, Dragon Age 4 will use the same engine according to some reports. The only good news about this, I guess, is the time that BioWare spent with this engine so far, so we could expect a much better result, but who knows. Anyway, to go back to our discussion about the flawed technical features from Inquisition, it wasn't all bad. It had some useful mechanics like setting your party members' behavior in fights. But if you're not playing the game on the hardest difficulty, you could get through most of the fights without even pausing the game once and using any kind of tactics. The action combat in Inquisition was pretty decent in general, if not a bit stiff, especially when it comes to character movement in fights. But even with all those problems, I think the gameplay in Inquisition was kinda fun actually, although fun is subjective. If we want to try and speculate about Dragon Age 4 combat, everything I mentioned so far is important to acknowledge. And that's basically everything that we can do at the moment. We don't have any gameplay footage that we can analyze. Like I said before, we only know that Dragon Age 4 will use the same engine. So what is the most likely scenario when it comes to the gameplay in the sequel? How about going back to the roots and focusing entirely on the tactical combat like in Origins? Back in 2009, when Origins released, we couldn't see a lot of new CRPGs with isometric gameplay. That was the period when a lot of people believed that PC gaming was dead. Fast forward to present day, we have a bunch of successful CRPGs that got released in the past few years. RPGs that are exclusively played through the isometric camera view. Divinity series, Pillars of Eternity series, Pathfinder Kingmaker, just to name a few. So CRPGs have never been so alive, but even though that's the case, I doubt that BioWare will go backwards with the gameplay. It's highly unlikely, even though I think a lot of fans of the series would love to see that happen. The next option would be to go with a pure action-oriented gameplay and completely ditch the tactics menu. Even though that option is highly unlikely as well, I would rather have a gameplay that focuses only on one thing, whether it's action or tactics. But let's face it, we are going to get a similar hybrid action gameplay like in Inquisition, it's just what makes the most sense. The big question is, how much will it improve? Will they fix the camera in the pause menu and improve the tactics features in general, or will they do something similar like in Dragon Age 2 and focus more on the action side of things, but still keep the tactics menu as a decoration basically? Like I mentioned before, the Frostbite engine was a big problem. All the problems which the camera had in the pause menu seem like an obvious engine limitation. If they leave the tactical camera in the game, but it's still really bad like in Inquisition, I'm going to be really disappointed. Even if they improve the tactics menu in general, there is no way in hell that we're going to get a similar amount of options like in Origins. And that's okay, as long as they make sure that each option which they include will actually work properly. Which brings us to the difficulty options in the game. I already mentioned that you absolutely didn't have to use the tactics menu unless you're playing on the hardest difficulty in Inquisition. If they want to make tactics relevant again, they would have to optimize every difficulty setting. I think that each difficulty option except easy should require the player to use some tactics, at least in fights versus stronger enemies. Otherwise, why would you bother with the pause menu and tactics if only a handful of players will get to experience it? It doesn't make sense. The best solution for this is kinda obvious. One universal difficulty would be great, but that probably won't happen. And what about the action gameplay improvements? Well, I'm glad you asked. You can love it or hate it, but the action gameplay in Inquisition is kinda unique. It was not a typical third-person action combat, even though it might look like that. But just because it's different, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was great. No matter which class you choose to play, the action gameplay turns into a spam fest. Use your abilities when they're off cooldown, auto-attack, and repeat without too much thought put into the process. The synergy between some abilities was nice, although a bit too simple. I would like to see more variety between classes when it comes to the synergy mechanic. And speaking about mechanics, if they want to give more identity to different classes, they could include some traditional action combat mechanics. For example, the stagger system would be one of them. It could improve the melee combat quite a bit, if implemented properly of course. When it comes to ranged classes, I think that mana and stamina should be more relevant as a resource. Inquisition skills were mostly based around cooldowns, which made stamina and mana kinda irrelevant. And that's ironic because managing those resources should make the gameplay more strategic. So yeah, I think that some traditional mechanics could make the combat in Dragon Age 4 a lot better. I didn't have any problems with animations or the sound and visual effects in fights. That was pretty good, and I believe that will continue to be the case in the sequel as well. That's pretty much it, I guess. There will be a lot more to talk about when we actually get some gameplay trailer, and I will definitely do another similar video when that happens, so be sure to stick around. Those would be my thoughts and wishes for the sequel when it comes to combat mechanics in particular. Tell me what you wish to see in Dragon Age 4 in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more RPG content. If you want to support the channel in the long run, consider becoming a Patreon or a YouTube member. You can get your name on the end credits, as well as some other perks like early access to videos, Discord roles, my plans for future content, etc, etc. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.